Welcome to Brain Chatter. Join us as we explore critical topics at the intersection of workplace culture and effective leadership. I'm your host, Derek Brown. Today's episode is Through the Looking Glass. Our guest is Dr. Ken Chapman. Dr. Chapman founded Ken Chapman Associates Incorporated almost 40 years ago. He's a native Alabamian, and his work experiences are wide-ranging, starting with being a supermarket bag boy, with later experiences including frontline supervisor, corporate vice president, and university professor. Dr. Chapman is the author of 5 books, the most widely known and distributed of which is The Leader's Code. He has degrees from Emory University in Atlanta and Columbia University in New York. During Dr. Chapman's decades of consulting, he has worked on 4 continents in over 500 electric generating stations, foundries, manufacturing facilities, corporate headquarters, nonprofits, banks, and more. I should also mention as a disclaimer that I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Chapman at Ken Chapman Associates and that the firm produces this podcast. You can read more about Dr. Chapman in this episode's notes at brainchatterpodcast.com, where you'll find a link to his bio and, as always, links to the resources we mention in the episode. Dr. Chapman, welcome to Brain Chatter.
Thanks, Derek. I'm glad to have this opportunity. I've been thinking about it a lot.
Will you discuss the practical implication of self-reflection on day-to-day leadership in an organization?
Well, Derek, let's begin with what self-reflection is not. Self-reflection is not, for example, a supervisor sitting on the floor with their legs folded, their forearms rested on their knees, with their hands open toward the sky. Meditation has value, but self-reflection is something different. Self-reflection can best be captured in the response that Peter Drucker gave to a question nearly 50 years ago. Now, many of the listeners will recognize that Peter Drucker is considered the father of modern management. Peter Drucker was asked this question: what is it that effective leaders do that other leaders fail to do? And his response was, effective leaders make time to think. Well, quite logically, the question that follows is, what is it that they make time to think about? And what they make time to think about, first and foremost, is their behavior and how their behavior impacts the behavior of the people who report to them, and how their behavior impacts the performance of the organization. And this is where Through the Looking Glass comes into play. Listeners will recognize this as the sequel to a more famous book, Alice in Wonderland. But the sequel, Through the Looking Glass, is in itself an intriguing children's book, but it has some important lessons for adults as well. And the big takeaway from Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll for me is this: it is very easy for life to become a figment of our imagination, or as the book ends, life is but a dream. Well, there's a kind of childish sweetness to that reference, but what it means for adults is simply this: it's a challenge for anyone to achieve some level of objectivity about themselves. It's a never-ending task, which is best addressed through self-reflection that allows us to get past our tendency to believe that what we think, what we feel, what we want is cleanly connected to reality, and that's often simply not true.
Could you share an example of this in a modern workplace?
Yeah. Let's begin with what is known as confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias sounds like a kind of fancy term that a psychologist would have made up, but it's a real term. And here's what it means. Confirmation bias means that everyone, me, you, our listeners, that all of us, left to our own devices, tend to look for information that confirms what we already think. Therefore, we have an inclination to read articles, to read books, to listen to what people have to say, to seek out data and information that says what we think is in fact a fact. That is okay as far as it goes. The problem is that we begin to subconsciously filter out anything that disagrees with our opinion. And as a consequence, we end up in a situation where we're not thinking outside of our own experience. We're not viewing things outside of our own limited intellectual or experiential background. Any effort to self-reflect has to take into account the fact that we're all inclined, we're all drawn to the things that confirm what we already believe. So the goal of self-reflection is to achieve some level of objectivity about our own opinions and thoughts and convictions, and to do it without becoming neurotic. And when I say without becoming neurotic, I mean becoming obsessed with second-guessing ourselves or obsessing about what mighta, coulda, woulda been, but simply seeking multiple sources to test our ideas against in a process that we'll call self-reflection. One final note that I would offer about this, and that is that self-reflection requires some measure of humility. There's simply no place for arrogance, egotism, certainly no place for self-righteousness or pettiness in self-reflection. It requires a genuine measure of humility.
Are there any best practices that you can suggest for how someone can start to self-reflect in a meaningful and practical way, particularly as it relates to their work life?
Another great question. It's the one that I'm most frequently asked about this whole concept of self-reflection, and that is, how do I go about it? Let me offer two strategies. The first one is the most obvious, and that is schedule time and place to think. Schedule a time and place to think. Just like you schedule your meetings with the people who report to you and with your colleagues, you schedule meetings with customers and clients, schedule time to think. That is, find a place, find a time, put it on your calendar with the goal, of course, of most of all thinking about yourself. Now, there is a tool that can be used to help with this. I recommend it. Not everyone finds it useful. It's called journaling. I've journaled, as it is known, for close to 30 years now. At the end of every day, with few exceptions, I make some entry in my journal. It usually has to do with something like a person I've met, whom I feel like I gained an insight from. It may be something that I read that I realize challenges what I have thought. But I try to enter in my journal not just the pleasant things that I want to remember, but also the things that cause me to self-reflect. The second suggestion I have about self-reflection is that if you don't like journaling and you're not particularly fond of spending time alone, an important alternative would be to find a confidant, someone inside your organization or a trusted friend or colleague outside the organization, someone who you can simply talk things through with. It's simply true that sometimes our greatest insights come from hearing the sound of our own voice bouncing off the ear of a trusted friend.
I suspect that most people listening to this podcast have been asked at some point in their life to define leadership. How do you respond when, and I'm sure it happens often, you are asked, what is leadership and where does it start?
Well, there's no shortage of definitions. In fact, if you go to a bookstore and look in the section for leaders and management, you see dozens of books, and just about every one of them's got a little different definition. And all of them have some value. The place to begin in understanding leadership is with me. No organization rises above its leader. So how well I manage me, how well I know me, how well I understand my impact on the performance of others will have a direct impact on the performance of the people who report to me and the organization. The reality is that any leadership or approach or strategy of leadership that's separated from self-understanding will likely fail, because no organization rises above its leadership. So let me define leadership in the context of self-reflection. Leadership is touching the lives of others for the better and touching the life of the organization for the better, providing them with the best insight, the best guidance, the best support that you can so that your people and your organization thrive.
Thank you. You've mentioned self-leadership alongside self-reflection. Of the innumerable times over your career that you've been called upon when there's a leadership issue within a client organization, what percentage of the time would you estimate that the lack of accurate self-reflection was really at the heart of the issue?
It's almost always true. It's almost always true that problems in the governance of an organization, problems in the performance of individuals within an organization, one way or another, sooner or late, come down to the inability of the leader to ask themselves critical questions about their own performance and their own interaction with other people. The place to begin is in the looking glass. And the looking glass, of course, is a Victorian reference to a mirror. Alice went through it. You don't have to do that. You can just stand on the front side of the mirror, look into it with some earnestness, and ask yourself important questions. For example, if you have a direct report who is not meeting your expectations, the place to begin is not in a conversation with that direct report. The place to begin is by looking in the mirror and asking yourself questions like, have I made the expectations clear? It's simply not reasonable to expect someone to meet an expectation you have not made clear. Another question would be, if they're not meeting expectations, is, are they trained to meet this expectation? Or do they have the knowledge and experience to meet it? And what can I do to assist with that? Another question would be, do they have the tools? I've given them this task to complete, this role and responsibility, but have I given them the tools that they need in order to complete that task and to produce that work product? And then, of course, another question I could ask myself when someone's not meeting expectations is, have I provided adequate feedback? At least enough feedback to keep them between the guardrails. So the place to begin is with me. And that's where most leaders fail when it comes to figuring out what's not working in their organizations.
So whether someone's an entry-level person just beginning their career or whether they're the CEO, if they want to stop and look in the mirror and say, am I effectively self-reflecting, how do they know if they're doing it effectively or not?
Well, I like that question because it gets to one of the things that always concerns me about these kinds of conversations, and that is that people end up being neurotic or narcissistic. They either become obsessed, neurotic about whether they are or are not, or they become obsessed with their own importance, more narcissistic. I think there's a fairly straightforward way to begin to accounting for how well you self-reflect. If over time you've managed to earn and keep the trust and respect of the people that you interact with regularly, personally and professionally, chances are you're doing a reasonably good job of self-reflecting, because the give and take of human interaction has to be constantly accounted for and adjusted so that in a conversation or in the direction provided to an organization, that you're taking into account how you impact those people, which is always changing. People's perceptions, even the people themselves, are always changing. Now, having said that, I think it's important to understand that when you use a word like respect, it's very easy for people to go down a rabbit hole. Now, when I mean, and that's not a pun related to the looking glass or anything, it's very easy for people to go down a rabbit hole. For example, it's very common in dysfunctional organizations for people to think that if a leader is respected, it must be that he's trusted. And that is not necessarily true. The reality is that you can get what appears to be respect through fear. People are simply afraid. They're deferential because they fear getting on your radar. And that kind of leader can appear to be respected, but what they've really done is created a prairie dog town. And a prairie dog town is where all the team members get into a hole and they poke their heads up just often enough to find out what they need to do, and then they go back into their hole hoping never to get noticed. Because they respect the leader, but only because they fear the leader. And then I think that we have to make our peace with the fact that being trusted and respected does not mean we have gotten to that place of respect and trust because people liked us. One of the most difficult things for a leader to get their mind around, particularly new supervisors or managers, new executives, is to get their mind around the idea that being liked has almost no value in and of itself. However, if people come to like you because they first trust and respect you, that has real value. After all, getting people to like you is really pretty easy. For one thing, all you got to do is tell them what they want to hear and give them what they want, which is the perfect formula for organizational failure. Real trust and respect comes from being willing to, for example, say what needs to be said, when it needs to be said, in the manner in which it should be said, while recognizing that sometimes that will feel good and sometimes it won't, but it simply has to be said.
Well, self-reflection is certainly not anything new. Can you speak to the background of the concept in human history and how far back it goes?
Yes, I think Derek probably knows what's coming in asking that question. I'm a big fan of the work of a fellow named Joseph Campbell. Back in the 1940s, his most famous work was published, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And what Joseph Campbell basically asserts in that book is the hero's journey is more common than most of us might imagine. Of the thousands of people that we meet in the course of our life, if we really knew what their life had been like, what their experience has been, what we would discover is that more often than not, there have been some genuinely heroic moments in their life. Just as Campbell outlines in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, there is this person. Sometimes it's us, sometimes it's a story we read or hear, but a person who's well-intentioned, who is faced with a challenge that they would have never chosen, and their first inclination is to shrink away, thinking they can't measure up. And yet they push themselves, make their best effort, and end up pushing through the challenge and accomplishing what they had intended to. And it is the thing that they would have never chosen that turns out to make them the person they are most proud to be. Now, if all of that sounds rather philosophical, let me give you a very current and easily recognizable reference point. The entire Star Wars trilogy is largely based on the findings of Joseph Campbell, that there is this person who wants to just live a life of peace, who is faced with a challenge they would not choose. They find their way through it, and they become the person that they want to be. The hero's journey is all about how a person becomes the hero of their own life story. I'm sensitive to the fact that I shouldn't run on and on here, but I do want to share with you a story out of my own experience that's more reality-based, perhaps, and be more familiar to you than maybe some of the characters in Star Wars. I find Star Wars intriguing, but I have to say there are some characters in the movies I haven't actually seen in real life. That said, let me tell you about a character that I have met. We'll call him Jay in order to protect his anonymity. But I met Jay in 1995. He was an electrician working in a paper mill just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Jay was what is known as an opinion leader. And when I say an opinion leader, he was a journeyman electrician, a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and he was an opinion leader because he had earned the respect of his peers and he had earned the trust and respect of management. He was a guy who would do his work, do it well with minimal supervision, help other folks learn and grow, and was very technically competent. He worked hard through practice, through actually hands-on effort to master his craft. One day, a position came open, maintenance supervisor, and there was a general feeling across the paper mill that there was really no need to apply, that Jay had it, that he would be selected because of the person that he was, how he was viewed by peers and management, and his skill set. But Jay was not chosen. He was not the successful candidate. And a lot of people were surprised, not the least of which was Jay. I ran into Jay a few days after the selection had been announced in the company cafeteria, sat down with him at lunch to see how he was doing, and he was not happy. He ranted, and he told me, he said, I've done everything the company wanted me to do. I've tried to be a good member of the team. I've tried to work with management in every way that I could. And I think most people would tell you that I'm a pretty good electrician. The truth is he was probably their best electrician. But if I can't get this job after all I've done, who can? And I let Jay finish, and then I asked a question. I asked Jay, is there anything that the successful candidate can do that you cannot do? And he immediately shot back, well, he can read. Everybody knows I can't read. I've never pretended that I could. And I said, Jay, everybody respects the fact that you are who you are and that you're candid and straightforward. But is there something you can do about that? And he said, no. He said, listen, my parents, they should have made sure I could read. The school, they should have made sure I could read. But now I'm 34 years old. There's nothing I can do. Well, I had to leave for an afternoon meeting, but as I left, I posed another question. I said, Jay, are you sure there's nothing you can do? Now, fast forward. It's nearly a year later, a little over 11 months. And I run into Jay in the entrance to the administration building at the mill. And we talk for a moment. And then he asked me a question. He says, you got a book in that briefcase of yours? And I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, let me have it. I took it out. I handed it to him. He opened it to a random page, and he began reading. And he didn't read stilted. He read very fluently. And I said, you did it, didn't you? And he said, yep. He said, I taught myself to read. I had some help, but I taught myself to read. How am I doing? I said, it sounds very good. But that's not the end of the story. Jay read every manual he could find on mill operations. He taught himself algebra and calculus and the laws of thermodynamics. And 26 years later, when he retired, he was the mill manager. He was the leader of that 900-person facility. Jay made himself the hero of his own story. He could have been a victim. He could have reflected on his life and concluded that he was a victim of other people's decisions. But he is one of those heroes with 1,000 faces. The guy who is faced with something he would never have chosen, reaching adulthood, not being able to read. And yet he refused to be the victim. He made himself the hero of his own story.
What an amazing illustration. I feel like we could just stop with this podcast right here. But I have more questions if you don't mind.
Okay.
If in history it is so obvious that self-reflection is important and it's obviously ancient and it's not hidden in any way, why is it not a priority in modern work life?
Well, I think that most people in leadership roles feel enormous time pressures. There are so many things that have to be done, so many people who you need to interact with, so many demands on the 24 hours in a day that you have. And of course, you have to work into all of that a life, often a family, often activities beyond the workplace, and of course, eating and sleeping. So there's enormous pressure to just push on, push on, push on. But the reality is that time spent thinking about our own behavior and how it impacts others is one of the best uses of time amid all the demands that are placed on us. And the reason for that is what we mentioned earlier, that the task of gaining some measure of objectivity about our own behavior is a never-ending task. And if we don't make the time to do that, we lose perspective. And with the loss of perspective means that we begin to see the moment as more important than it is. And we forget that life is not a single event. Work is not a single event. It is a series of events. And self-reflection allows us to recognize that with greater regularity.
When you see an organizational leader who clearly has a self-reflection deficit or avoidance, how do you assist that person in coming to terms with that factor?
Well, it's always a challenge, particularly if someone's not in the habit of self-reflecting. They're not in the habit of getting outside their own preference for their own opinions, their own feelings, their own decisions. But what I do is fairly simple. I avoid telling them they're wrong. It's not helpful. Instead, I appeal to their highest opinion of themselves, and I try to help them become connected to their highest opinion of themselves. I would take you back to the illustration I just offered, the example of Jay. Jay was very angry, and understandably so. He was right in the sense that the school system and his family of origin had not come through for him. But what he needed was not to have me reinforce his anger toward the people who had failed him, but to point him toward the person that he wanted to be. We already knew who he wanted to be. He wanted to be someone who had earned the trust and respect of others. He had been doing that with peers and management. And he wanted to be someone who could realize his potential. Turns out that potential was the mill manager's job. What I needed to do that day in that conversation was to help Jay think through how to connect with the person that he wanted to be, that highest opinion of himself.
Well, Dr. Chapman, anyone who knows you, certainly including me, knows you are extremely adept at asking extremely thoughtful, insightful questions of others. And I'm talking about the kind of question that helps both sides see things more clearly after the question than before it was asked. Even when it's uncomfortable, you really have an amazing ability to do this. How have you developed this skill so proficiently over your career?
Well, Derek, your question is asked in a very kind and gracious manner, and I appreciate that. But it does make me sound like a better person than I am. I would say this: it's a skill I've developed, and I began developing it because I came to self-reflection as a young man, kicking and screaming. I was very confident, very certain. Was fortunate enough to have some great opportunities as a young man. And it was very tempting for some period of time for me to think that I knew what there was to know, which is never true. So the ability to ask these questions began with my own effort to ask them of myself. And as a result, I've come to believe that if you can simply ask people questions that invite them to learn the lessons that life will teach, if you're willing to pay attention, they tend to be receptive. And that really goes to the philosophical position from which I come to that task. So let me share that with you just briefly. This is what I believe. I believe that life and work is a journey, that life and work is a journey with many lessons to be learned. And that sometimes the lessons are easy, they're kind of fun, and sometimes the lessons are hard. All that can reasonably be expected is that we learn the lesson and then we allow ourselves to move on.
In some cases, Ken Chapman Associates Incorporated is hired to help identify what underlying workplace culture issues are at the core of some costly company challenge. So, such as maybe one corporate division's higher incidences of lawsuits or turnover, maybe union or regulatory complaints, safety issues, or even worse. In these situations, going back to the hero's journey you described earlier, where we see the same stories played over and over in human history, how does that knowledge help in the diagnosis of modern workplace problems?
Oh, it's very helpful. Over these 40 years, I've worked with organizations who were presented with a challenge they would never choose, just like the individual in the hero's journey. And how they responded to that always determined what the course and future of the organization was going to be. For example, I work with an organization that an executive blew up the company plane, killing some people on board along with himself. The president of that company could have easily seen himself as the victim of circumstances, but he did not. Instead, he took some time, thought through what had happened, how the events had come to unfold as they did, and recognized what he had done, what he needed to do and should do, and made significant changes in his own behavior and in the expectations of the organization. And that organization met the challenge, pushed through, and continues to thrive to this day. There have been instances where organizations we worked with had media events that were crushing and threatening to the very existence of the organization. But because the leadership could self-reflect, they could get past their own hurt feelings or disappointment. They could get past their own ego. They could get past their own sense of what is fair and simply see the world as it is and connect to reality. They were able to make decisions that allowed them to push through the challenge that they would have never chosen and become the organization that they're proud to be today.
Wow. After your years of work in this arena related to workplace culture and workplace leadership, which touches on so many elements of business success, does anything ever surprise you?
Well, let me say this, Derek. Bad behavior doesn't surprise me anymore. The interesting thing is that bad actors always seem to think that they're kind of unique or special, and yet they're the most common. What continues to surprise me, and it's a very gratifying surprise, is that people can in fact be very heroic. I admire the person who refuses to be a victim, who refuses to look at the things that they would not choose in their life, which are a part of their life, and to say, there's nothing I can do. I admire the people who look at the world as it is, accept the reality, and do what they can do to become the hero of their own story. That is always a very nice surprise to see how heroic people can be when you think that I can't imagine how they're going to do this.
What do you think will be one of the greatest challenges related to workplace culture and leadership in the future? Will things change dramatically, do you think, from the enduring challenges that you've seen throughout your career and looking back far into the past?
Well, yes, things are changing all the time. They have changed. Certainly the world that our firm, works in today is not the world that we were working in 40 years ago. That said, there's something that I think it's essential that leaders not forget. People are people no matter where you find them, and that is true in terms of time as well as generations. When I look back at the people I worked with 40 years ago, all of them wanted to be valued. All of them wanted to be able to make sense out of their work, and all of them wanted a sense of purpose. Call it pride of workmanship if you want. And that is what I see in the best people today, whether they are hourly employees or executives, anywhere in between. They want to be valued. They want to be able to make sense out of their work and their world. And they want to have a sense of purpose, to feel like that there really is something of value they're contributing to the world in which they live.
What would you say have been some of the most fulfilling components of your career so far as you've worked in this arena?
Well, a lifetime ago, I was younger than almost all the decision makers that I worked with at that time. Now I'm pretty much older than all of the decision makers that our firm works with. And what I've discovered is that the marketplace, free enterprise, capitalism if you prefer the word, but certainly free enterprise, is simply a way of expressing what is natural to the human experience. And that is that people want to feel like they have an opportunity to work, to achieve, to be proud, to be the hero of their own story. And that more than any other economic system, this provides the opportunity for that. Now, with that said, I would also add that it's always very gratifying to work with people who come up to you and say, "Thank you. I'm glad to find out I'm not crazy after all." And these are usually people who have been working in dysfunctional organizations. And when they say, I want you to know that I'm glad to discover I'm not crazy after all, what they're referring to is that I wasn't wrong to think that people wanted to be treated with dignity and respect. I wasn't wrong to think that people wanted to be able to make sense out of their work. I wasn't wrong to think that people want to be proud of what they do and the people they do it with. I'm not crazy after all. And then last of all, and as concerns that, I would say this. For me, what's been the most gratifying is when someone comes up to me and says, "You know, you've made a difference. Your firm, your associates, they've made a difference in our organization. but I got to tell you, it's been most helpful to me at home. I'm going to be able to stay married. I'm going to find my way through this problem with my adolescent daughter or son because of the things that y'all have helped me understand. Those are the most gratifying. Because life isn't just work. Work helps to create the life that we want, but life is not just work.
When we were brainstorming for a name for this podcast at the beginning of 2020, you were the one who came up with the name Brain Chatter. Would you care to discuss the meaning of this phrase?
Well, sure. And thanks for giving me credit. Here's my thought behind that. All of us live with a lot of brain chatter. It's simply a fact that all of us, every waking moment of the day, we're telling ourselves stories about our experience with people, what we did, what we wish we had done, about what we're going to do. There's a storyline running constantly in our heads. That's the brain chatter, our self-talk. Of course, it's important that that self-talk be healthy. We don't want to talk to ourselves the way we wouldn't, in a manner that we wouldn't want to talk to someone else. We want to be affirming, positive, fair, and patient in our self-talk. But we're always talking to each other. There's a lot of brain chatter going on in our heads. But in addition to all the chatter that we generate in our own heads, between our ears, there's all the chatter that comes at us. All the things that people are saying that are helpful, all the things people are saying that are not helpful. So the idea behind brain chatter is, how do I as a leader cut through all the chatter? And as Derek defines it, every podcast, to get in touch with the realities that are closest to how I be effective as a leader. If you want to, you can call that self-reflection.
Thank you. Dr. Chapman, what else should I have asked you that I have not in this podcast episode? Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation before we call it a wrap?
No, I think that you pretty well covered it, Derek. Of course, there's a lot more that could be said, and maybe we'll do that sometime. But I would just close with a summary, if I could, please. Self-reflection is about the discipline of keeping our head out of the sand and firmly in reality. What I think, what I feel, what I want must be tempered and measured and guided by reality. Self-reflection helps me do that, whether I do it by myself in a specific time and place, or I do it by way of a friend listening to my thoughts and gaining insight from the sound of my voice bouncing off their ear. Objective reality is my best friend. Sometimes that objective reality feels really good, and sometimes it hurts and burns before it heals. But reality is my friend.
Thank you for your valuable time on the podcast, Dr. Chapman. For the convenience of those listening, we're going to post a link to your bio, a link to your book, The Leader's Code, and links to the resources that we discussed. Those can be found online at brainchatterpodcast.com. Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman Associates, Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building, making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for almost 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com.